Week 1 of the Overwatch League's 5th season is now in the books, and boy, what an entertaining weekend it was. The first 4 days of North American action gave us our first opportunity to see pro players properly play on a beta build for Overwatch 2, and they certainly didn't disappoint. This weekend saw a number of very surprising upsets, a welcome return to an Overwatch LAN event, and one of the teams was even caught cheating, believe it or not. So then, with so many different discussions and storylines coming out of this weekend, today I wanted to talk to you all about what I thought were the 5 biggest things we learnt from OWL's 2022 opening weekend. Coming in at number 1, the first thing I wanted to discuss, and in my opinion what was the most interesting thing to come out of this weekend, was the differences in philosophy that we saw in terms of what compositions each team ran, leaving us with a meta that looks and feels quite diverse. The opening few matches of the week perhaps gave the impression that the meta would consist of a team composition, including a Genji Soldier DPS duo, Winston as a solo tank, and a support pairing of Lucio Ana. Indeed, there were a number of teams who for the most part utilised this comp to great effect and success, such as the LA Gladiators and the San Francisco Shock. But then came the live homestand event between the Dallas Fuel and the Houston Outlaws, which seemed to throw a major spanner in the works, with Dallas becoming completely unstuck on this composition, in the face of Houston revealing a solo tank Doomfist and a swap from Genji to Echo, eventually leading to one of the biggest upsets of the weekend as the Fuel was swept 3-0 by the Outlaws. I found this fascinating, as unlike teams like the Gladiators or Shock, there were other teams like Houston, but also indeed Atlanta, that greatly favoured running the Doomfist and appeared to believe that on balance it was the stronger choice compared to Winston. Interestingly, from the evidence of this weekend alone, it's impossible to say which is the superior approach, as although Houston dismantled Dallas with this comp on Friday, Sunday night concluded with the Outlaws falling short in the Doom vs Winston confrontation to Toronto of all teams. In my opinion, I personally believe that the Winston is slightly better and less volatile overall compared to the Doomfist comps, but it's still way too early to say, and that just makes me incredibly excited to see what happens in week 2. Whilst these two approaches on paper look the strongest, I would be remiss for saying that they were the only comps we saw from some of the teams this weekend, notably London, who opted for a brawlier Mei Rhine setup, whilst there were also instances of off-tanks like Zarya, D.Va or Sigma also being played. Now aside from some of these comps being somewhat map specific, for me these brawl comps feel like a legacy of the rush comps from recent years, but a lot of the weaker teams utilised to pose a more unique challenge to their opponents, whilst being able to keep their players on more comfort picks. In the long run, I don't think it'll cause teams like San Francisco or LA much of a challenge, but regardless, the variety and mixed success of all these different compositions, without there being a fixed singular meta comp, feels very healthy for the league to start the season, and I'm very excited to see where we go from here. The second topic that needs to be mentioned is the sorry state of most people's power rankings, following what can only be described as a bizarre set of results from OWL's opening weekend of 2022. Now to be fair, the top and bottom of North America feels somewhat clear cut, with the Shock and Gladiators looking the most impressive to me, whereas New York and Vancouver appear to be the weakest. The middle though is just a confusing mess, with it being almost impossible to differentiate between the quality of each side, something that's great for the competition and excitement of the league, but terrible for our personal power rankings. To give you an idea of what I mean, let's take the Toronto Defiant. They were at the centre of another of the league's major upsets this week, defeating Houston 3-2 in the last match of the opening weekend. This was particularly a surprise, given the Outlaws had started the week with a statement upset of their own, a brilliant 3-0 sweep over the Dallas Fuel as I mentioned earlier. Now Dallas managed to rectify things with an important 3-0 win of their own over Washington, but to make things overly complicated, this was the Justice side that had started the season with a relatively comfortable victory over the Defiant. So just based on victories over one another alone, the Defiant are better than the Outlaws, who are better than the Fuel, who are better than the Justice, who are better than the Defiant? Can this get any more confusing? Of course we need to factor in the fact that some of these teams are just simply better matchups for one another, but until we have more data at our disposal, this will make ranking the teams quite a difficult proposition in the short term, especially heading into next week. But if that means we get a more entertaining product on a week-to-week basis, I couldn't care less. Moving on to my third talking point, I wanted to highlight how impressed I was with the majority of the rookies that we saw for the first time on the Overwatch League stage. From Reiner on the Gladiators to the Atlanta and Toronto supports of Ultraviolet and Chorong, and you could even say Landon on London, all had really solid debuts, with few rookies overall struggling to adjust to Overwatch League level competition, with maybe the exception of Pattypan, but in general his performances were more of a rollercoaster affair, with both highs and lows. And then there's the San Francisco Shock, who in my opinion were the most impressive team in the opening weekend, and that was primarily down to the 4 rookies that they have in their starting lineup. with Violet filling in as an experienced veteran on the more unfamiliar role for him of main support. Sam and Proper were excellent over the course of their 2 matches, with both coming up with some major highlight plays, and although Kilo saw very minimal action, he was still quite good. Kaluja also had a great debut as the team's only tank, but it was Finn for me who I thought left the biggest impression. He was outstanding in both of their series against Paris and London, and he could prove to be an incredibly important asset, as it appears that flex supports are quite an impactful and influential role in how Overwatch 2 is currently being played. If he can carry forward this momentum alongside his teammates into a more difficult test against Houston next week, the Shock could quickly establish themselves as one of the teams to beat in the West this year. The fourth thing that I think we learnt about regards our new map type for Overwatch 2 and the Overwatch League: push. It's still way too early to get a good gauge on how we'll all feel about this mode later on in the season, but for now the best way I would describe it is as chaotic fun. It was noticeable that the teams that did play push struggled a bit with structuring their attacks, with many of the fights devolving a little bit into something more resembling team deathmatch. It will certainly take some time for the pros to fully understand the mode, and that's why I think we saw a couple of instances where the team seemed to forget about the robot altogether and were drawn into those deathmatch style engagements, a form of Overwatch that will appeal to some, but perhaps not others. In any case, I think this was a promising showcase to start the season, and I'm cautiously optimistic about what's to come in the following weeks ahead. The last topic I wanted to touch on very quickly was the bizarre instance from yesterday's series between Florida and Paris, where the Mayhem were found to be guilty of performing a, quote, illegal manoeuvre, which led to them having to replay their attack run on Circuit Royale. The move in question, as you can see, regards the use of a teleporter on a May wall in a place that is deemed by the league to be an exploit. Now, I have seen both sides of the argument when it comes to what happened and what the league subsequently decided, and I'm torn. It was a lot of fun, especially watching live. There's certainly been times during contenders in the past where similar sorts of things haven't been restarted, despite using an exploit, such as on Eichenwald first point. If this is the rules though, then fair enough. Perhaps this is something they could look at editing moving forward, but I don't know. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. On that note though, that's where I'm going to leave it today, so I want to thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Tomorrow I'll be bringing you all my first weekly power rankings update, so until next time, I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.